Hello, and welcome to the Natural State Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin. It is my belief that the natural state of any living organism is health, and that our artificial habitat has forced us into having artificial health problems. This show is my attempt to dive deep and learn about using nutrition, sleep, movement, relationships, and more to help you reclaim your natural state of health in a modern world and show you how to thrive in an environment that's stacked against you. If you enjoyed today's show, you can find out more details and information at dranthonygustin.com. Today, I welcome Dr. Anthony J. to the podcast, who is an expert in a lot of things. He's a researcher at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. He brings his knowledge around xenoestrogens, so things in your environment that act like estrogen that really mimic your hormones and change your hormonal status, which can be linked to things like breast cancer, all the way down to hormonal disruptions. Like the list is sort of endless here, and he does a great job breaking it down where you're going to find these things in the environment, how to fix them if you have these problems. And as well, he's an expert in DNA analysis, so we chat a lot about that as well. So a lot of interesting stuff in this podcast. I actually learned quite a bit myself. So tune into this one, and I hope you guys are taking notes and enjoy. This episode of the Natural State Podcast is brought to you by 4-Sigmatic. 4-Sigmatic is my favorite purveyor of all things mushrooms and adaptogens. Not sure why these things are important? Well, you can start with my episode I did with 4-Sigmatic founder Tara on this subject, but just understand that mushrooms are not part of either animal or plant kingdom. They have unique health properties that are very, very well researched. Everything between boosting mental clarity all the way to naturally supporting the immune system, which I'm sure is something that everybody cares about these days. Also, 4-Sigmatic products have been stocked in our kitchen at the Perfect Keto offices for years now and are probably the second most consumed product next to our own. Their most popular product of coffee mixed with chaga, cordyceps, lion's mane mushrooms, etc. Everything to basically take the jitter away from coffee and add a lot of brain boosting elements is the fan favorite at the office, and keeps everyone powered through long days without crashing, like they probably would if they had an IV drip of cold brew like most other startups do. Alas, I have been off of caffeine for the last 6 months or so. I've been trying to give my body a rest and recover and get my nervous system back to a point where it's not always thinking it's getting chased by a lion. So what I've been doing is I've been using their adaptogen powder, which has 10 different mushrooms, roots, leaves, berries, and superfoods, with their mushroom blend that has another 10 different types of mushrooms every day for the last 6 months or so. And I've actually personally seen a huge improvement in my HRV, stress levels, recovery, etc. If I'm facing down a really big work day, I actually added an extra packet of both their lion's mane and cordyceps and mix all of that together with a scoop of exogenous ketones, and it lights my brain up like nothing else can. I've asked the team at 4-Sigmatic to hook you guys up, and so they're giving all listeners of the Natural State Podcast 15% off your 4-Sigmatic order. Just go to 4sigmatic.com/AG15 or enter code AG15, that's AG15 at checkout. That is FOURSIGMATIC.com/AG15 to receive 15% off your order. This show is also brought to you by Alitura Naturals. When I considered sponsors for this show, I reached out to Andy, who is the founder of Alitura, and pretty much begged him to support the show just because they are the only products that I trust to put on my skin. So much garbage is in skincare products that it blows my mind. I cannot find any other products. I do not put anything else on my body other than Alitura. It's actually a lie. I use White Oak Pasture's beef tallow soap in the shower, but other than that, everything sort of pre-post around that is Alitura. And if you don't know why, your skin is the largest organ in your body. It absorbs everything you put on it. And men are less known for using sort of skincare products, but women average over 250 chemicals that are in their bloodstream from their skincare products by the time they walk out the door in the morning. That is ridiculous. I personally use the moisturizer, the clay mask in my sauna, and the pearl cleanser. My fiance uses way more. She has a little bit more of a skincare routine than I. And the products themselves are made with the highest end ingredients that you would ever find in skincare products. This stuff's incredible. Andy himself is a testament how these products work. He's been on the podcast before to tell his story, but it was amazing. He was in a horrific accident. His face got all mangled up, and he basically made this formula to heal his scars, and he is now a male model. That is not a joke. He has incredible skin, and is obsessed with the quality of his ingredients and the sourcing of them. He was just in Hawaii recently sourcing one ingredient of the many that are in one of his products. This guy goes, visits every single farm and product, and it is incredible. The quality you get here is by far the best in the industry. And so I begged him to sponsor the show and also begged him to give you guys a little bit of a hookup. So if you use code AG20, you'll get 20% off in free shipping over at alitura.com. That's AG20 at ALITURA to get 20% off your order at alitura.com. Doc, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So I don't even know where to start because your background is so vast and you have so many different specialties, and like you can geek out on so many different things. So it's kind of a really, these conversations are great to have, but it's always tough to know, where we want to dive in first. But I think that what would be good is just chatting about sort of your background and what you got you so fascinated in health in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. So I did my PhD in biochemistry at Boston University Med School.
What was the sort of impetus for choosing that career path?
I was doing Alzheimer's research directly out of college, and I enjoyed the actual research component. I was going to go to med school, but I started working in a lab and doing research. I liked the freedom. I liked the thinking behind it, the creativity. And my brother became a doctor, and it just didn't seem as enjoyable. Not that his life is bad, but it just didn't seem as free.
It's certainly not for everybody. It's like, I don't practice anymore, and I understand that may work for some people, but having a full schedule of patient work every single day, and it wasn't for me as far as how I wanted to live my life and the lifestyle I wanted. So different stuff works for different people for sure.
Yeah. So then I got into hormones specifically and ended up writing a book on fake hormones, or xenoestrogens, are chemicals that act like estrogen, because I was doing my PhD on fats and cholesterol and hormones. And I was shocked by how many of these chemicals are in our environment, like BPA. Everybody knew about BPA being bad. BPA-free plastic bottles started to come out. But, that was one thing. Most people didn't realize BPA is bad because it acts like estrogen, but they kind of had a sense that it was bad. But then there's this whole other list of similar chemicals that also act like estrogen. So I ended up writing a book on that. And in the meantime, I also started optimizing my own health, started doing genetic analysis, started a company doing DNA analysis. So a lot of different things, like you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah. And so your PhD was in what exactly?
Biochemistry.
Got it. And so you said you were studying fats and a lot of things like that. What were the big aha moments you had during that process?
Yeah, good question. The big one, by far the big one, was this dogma that cholesterol is so healthy for you. That it's so bad for you, and statins are so healthy for you. Like, we should put statins in the drinking water and all this. And I started to realize, by actually looking at the research really, really carefully, and it's a mess, but I started to realize cholesterol is not bad for you. It's absolutely critical for your body. All the cells have it in your body. And this idea that high cholesterol is so terrible for you is super inflated. When they teach doctors and they teach us scientists, the example they use is familial hypercholesterolemia, which basically means, it's a genetic mutation and your cholesterol is outrageously high. It's like 500-600. And you get plaques and you get heart disease, oftentimes heart attacks by age 20, age 30, things like that. But they kind of use that to say, look, when cholesterol is high, you get heart attacks. And then when it's lower, you don't get heart attacks. The problem with that is if it gets too low, your health is super suboptimal. You have no energy, your sex hormones go way down, your brain function goes way down. So then you have all these other health issues. And so there's obviously a sweet spot. And the big aha for me was that cholesterol, again, not bad. When it gets to a certain level, usually it's above 300, your total cholesterol gets above 300, things like that. It stays in your body so long, it reacts with oxygen, it becomes oxidized. You've got oxygen on your red blood cells, and the cholesterol itself becomes a problem. It becomes inflammatory. And that's totally different when you're talking about oxidized cholesterol versus regular cholesterol. But most doctors, most teachers, most scientists, they don't have that nuance. They don't teach it that way. They just basically say cholesterol is bad and we need to all be on statins.
Right. I mean, which is insane. I think that sort of the example you gave around just the fact that it's high, and if it's high, people with heart disease have this like high lab value that we should eradicate it entirely is insane. It's sort of like just thinking about it, sort of a recent example of, okay, we have all these wildfires and there are trees in the wildfires. Therefore, we should just mow down all trees. It's like, no, let's ask the question of what started the fire in the first place and be curious about that, and then how to stop it and reverse some of these things. And I think that medicine in general is just frankly terrible at assessing how did we get here in the first place and what is the root cause of this. And it's not a Lipitor deficiency, and this is the really bizarre thing of, okay, if it is a repair molecule from an inflammatory process, why not look at the inflammatory process and why it's there in the first place?
Exactly.
But takes some work, takes some nuance, and a lot of people, I think that doctors don't mean poorly. It's that they don't have time. They're set up in a system, and we just talked about, like, I had a luxury of doing cash only in my practice, and we spent an hour with every patient. But I don't know if your family or any other doctors that it's like the average time now is 8 minutes with the patient,
right.
And they have to play this game about insurance companies, and they get information around how they diagnose and treat things, and so it's just an entire system that's set up to stay misinformed and not admit, like, oh, we were wrong about this thing. Let's just get better at it and move forward.
Yeah. I mean, there was a study in 2019 with 12.8 million people looking at total cholesterol, and it was like a bell curve, but an inverted bell curve. It was basically showing that as your total cholesterol, as it got below 200, your all-cause mortality went sky high. So like the idea that your cholesterol is 140, so it's amazing. You're vegan, your cholesterol is 150. That's amazing. High five. It's actually a really terrible idea because you're at a huge risk for Alzheimer's and all kinds of other health issues. The optimal range in that study, it was between 200 and about 280 for your total cholesterol. And it's like you said, it's all about inflammation. So things like that, when I started to learn things like that, and of course that study wasn't out a long time ago when I was doing my PhD, but the indicators were there. It was definitely becoming obvious that, the inflammation was the root cause. We need to address the inflammation. Things like that basically shifted my focus, and it also shifted my trust, because I just was blindly trusting all these professors and all these doctors and what I was being told. And then I started to realize a lot of this is just dogma. A lot of this is just things that the teachers were taught, and they're just, reiterating and repeating what they were told. And it's not true. It's not correct. It's false. It's misleading oftentimes. And again, with the xenoestrogens, the artificial estrogens, nobody was even talking about that at all.
Yeah. I mean, we have sort of a set of things that we track classically currently. And I think that even a conversation around reference ranges and how stupid they are, and in general, like how we come up with them and how we judge people based upon these simple things, like, okay, your cholesterol is above this certain amount, therefore you get this medication. And I mean, we're not even talking about LDL itself, which is total cholesterol, which is even dumber of a thing to look at. And so these are the things that we observe and we track and we try to manage through their lifestyle and medication. And like you said, like, okay, we have now all these xenoestrogens coming in. These are things that people aren't even looking at yet. I think the simplicity around how a lot of doctors operate now is there's a standard sort of chem panel, and there's a lipid panel, and then maybe if you're lucky, you get like a thyroid and a liver screen as well. But there's just this very broad, blunt sort of instrument where you apply trying to assess if people are healthy or not. That's just this very, very crazy, like high level screen that doesn't even pick up even close to everything we need to know our bodies are functioning appropriately. So I guess like when you started shifting from this sort of, research into fat and these awareness, like, okay, something's wrong here. Let's sort of put I have to think for myself, which I think anybody who figures out all this stuff is like the thing you said around these people are all talking about bullshit and I can't trust anybody. I have to do the work myself. Anybody who has that mindset, I think is going to be successful long-term, just because we live in a world where I don't think many authority figures can be trusted and all the orthodox information we have is just faulty. I mean, I don't know what the quote is, this Mark Twain quote of whenever you find yourself on the side of majority, it's time to pause and reflect. I think that applies to all things in health as well. And so it's like curious, like when you started diving into this stuff, what were some of the big things like, oh damn, like these things could be causing this. They're tied to that. We don't know that they're in all of our food products, hair products, plastics, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, for just speaking of those normal reference ranges, you know, the testosterone, again, while I was doing my PhD, they started to lower the normal range for testosterone. So you could come in with a 350 and they would tell you you're low, but then a few years later, they lowered the range so that if you came in with a 350, they'd tell you you're fine. And then even again, they lowered it down to 250. So they just continuously lowered it because so many people were coming in with low testosterone. And ironically, all these chemicals that act like estrogen in our body, they also lower your testosterone. And we've just increased our production. We've increased our exposures. And the book that I wrote on it was not just about artificial estrogen chemicals, because there's a million of them. Agent Orange disrupts your sex hormones. You know, they call it a dioxin. It's in the dioxin class, dioxin. And, you know, the thing about Agent Orange, we're not exposed to Agent Orange, hopefully. So I'm not that interested in Agent Orange or all these other millions of estrogen chemicals. I want to know which ones we're exposed to every single day, because there's actually a surprising amount. And the plastics are a big one, of course, because people are storing liquids in plastics. They're heating up foods in plastics. There's a lot of leaching. There's a lot of denial that there's leaching. And there used to be denial around BPA leaching. I don't know if you remember, but they used to say BPA doesn't leach. It's okay. BPA is fine. It doesn't leach.
Right. I mean, I think with a lot of these things, we said the same thing about Crisco. Oh, it's fine. And now we're saying the same thing about vegetable oils. It's like anything man-made, in my opinion, is like it's only a matter of time until we figure out how it's screwing up our health. Like any way our environment is altered from what it should be in like sort of a natural environment. I mean, we'll figure it out at some point, and whether we understand the mechanism or not doesn't really matter. So yeah, I mean, this is a question I want to ask you too is just like, okay, so you said, you know, BPA and some of these things we know, and that's the case, but like, are there still just tons of other things that we don't recognize or isolate or have the research to really point to definitively that are in plastics that are terrible for people?
Exactly. Now it's phthalates. It used to be BPA. In fact, in the 1940s, they were studying BPA as a birth control. They were thinking it's going to be an excellent birth control. Let's research it for that. It was pretty obvious it acted like estrogen. Then they learned that it could be turned into plastic. They shifted gears, told everybody it doesn't leach. Now that we can test it down to the nanogram level, which is 10 to the minus 9th grams, you know, which is the same level that our hormones are at, you know, our sex hormones like testosterone, estrogen. In men, estrogen is about 20 nanograms per liter. And in women, it's about 20 to 200, depending on the time of the month. But nanogram levels, right? And the BPA, we've realized now it leaches at those levels all the time. There's even at room temp, even when you've got cold water. And now, again, the emphasis is shifted to saying that phthalates don't leach. I've even had targeted ads on Facebook telling me that phthalates don't leach. So there's literally companies out there promoting this idea, paying money for ads to tell people that plastics are safe. The phthalates, which is spelled PHTHALATES, phthalates, it's okay, they don't leach. Most of the plastics have phthalates, virtually all of them. It's okay, they don't leach. Plastic 4 or 5 sometimes don't have phthalates, but you know, if you look on that little recycling symbol on the plastic, if there's a number 1 on that symbol, that stands for polyethylene terephthalate. That's basically a phthalate-derived plastic. It's a plastic that's made from phthalates. And if you go to these third-party testing companies, which I've done, to get the actual water product tested, like a bottle of water, you get a 24-pack of bottled waters, let's test it out. They'll measure BPA down to the nanograms, down to like, you know, 0.1 nanograms per liter. If, you know, for like $300 per sample, which is absurd, but they'll do it for you. But then with the phthalates, they'll measure it to like 100,000 nanograms per liter. So if you're paying $300 to get a sample tested, even the third-party companies that are out there right now, they're not even close to measuring a range that's relevant to our health. And if you do those measurements, and again, those are scientific studies, and I can't do it independently. You have to have a lab set up specifically, they're in there. The phthalates are leaching even at room temp. Certainly if you're heating it up, so in other words, the point is all these liquids, these food products, again, liquids, soups, water in plastic bottles, you got to get away from that and filter your drinking water because a lot of the pipes are plastic.
So as far as the plastic goes, like you said, if this is the one has the phthalates in it, not great. Is there sort of a hierarchy you think, or is it just like eliminate and get away from every single plastic you possibly can?
Yeah, it's better to just get rid of as many as you can. If there's solids in it, it's no big deal. If you're freezing, it's no big deal. And the crazy thing about phthalates is they put them in fragrances too. They put them in perfumes because it's a cheap petroleum product that's derived from oil. So they use it to thin down your perfumes and fragrances. But of course, it's still estrogenic. You put it on your skin, it goes through your skin like a testosterone cream would go through your skin. And so you got to be careful with the fragrances too, because not only is that an estrogenic component, is that those chemicals act like estrogen, but also they have parabens a lot of times in the fragrances. And they don't even have to put it on the label. They can sneak it in there without putting anything on the label about it because it's their secret formula. So the government protects their proprietary formula. So fragrances are another hidden source of daily estrogen exposures, even if it's the soap you're using.
I think I had someone on the podcast before, and I think she said that there's like 400 plus chemicals that can be labeled as just broadly as a fragrance on a product.
Right.
Phthalates included, which is just frightening. And like, I didn't even think about the water traveling through plastic pipes. I mean, there's, I think, a lot of reasons to filter your water, but I haven't even considered that one being super important. Is that how most city water is piped from the main thing to the house is by plastic?
Yeah, for sure. PVC. And then now they're switching over to PEX, but that also has phthalates. I've looked at the studies. I've done a YouTube video on it. It's better than PVC, but it's still got a higher than you want exposure with phthalates. But carbon, the good news is carbon filters it out. Activated charcoal. If you've got a filter with activated charcoal, and most do, Brita filters all that. But then, of course, a lot of the filters, you filter the water and then you store it in plastic.
That's insane. So as far as filtering water and stuff like that, you said carbon. Is there anything else you look at? I have a crazy whole home filter here that I could get into.
I do too. Yeah.
Curious is like how you think about that and different stages of filtering, maybe even beyond just the direct phthalate from the plastic.
Yeah. I mean, there's other things I want to get rid of, like fluoride and things like that. I personally have reverse osmosis, so I get rid of everything. But I don't have one of those reverse osmosis systems that has a plastic tank under my sink.
Okay.
I have one of these. It's actually stainless steel, and it has a pump in it, so you can turn it on, and it'll just pump forever. It'll never shut off. It doesn't run out of water in that plastic tank because there is no plastic tank. But that filter I have, it's got cotton to get rid of huge particles. But then the next stage, it's 4 stages: cotton, activated charcoal. Third stage is reverse osmosis, gets rid of everything. And the last stage is magnesium. It basically remineralizes the water, puts magnesium back in.
Yeah.
So that's how I do it. But I also have a whole house filter as well that's just activated charcoal to get rid of the estrogens coming into my house.
Got it. Okay. And then as far as when you say these things are estrogenic, things like that, I mean, I'm sure people may have heard of this term before, but probably don't understand fully what that means. If you want to break it down for people.
Oh, yeah. Well, it just acts like estrogen in your body. So you have these receptors that pick up estrogen. And it's kind of funny because testosterone has one receptor. It's called the androgen receptor. So when you've got testosterone in your body, it's going around your bloodstream and it sticks to this thing called the androgen receptor. Real simple. And just like men, real simple. And women are more complicated. Estrogen's more complicated, I usually like to say, because estrogen, there's actually 2 receptors. There's estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta. So there's actually 2 different things that can stick in your body. And the crazy thing with estrogen is you've got receptors all over the place in your body that pick up estrogen. So you've heard of leptin, right? The hunger hormone. So leptin only has receptors in your brain. So when your fat cells produce leptin after you eat, it goes into your liver, it comes out of your liver. There's no receptors there that pick it up. It goes into your muscles, it comes out of your muscles. There's no receptors there to pick it up. But when it gets to your brain, there's receptors there. It sticks to those receptors. Leptin sticks to them, tells you that you're hungry, tells you to stop eating. That's your body's signal. Estrogen, on the other hand, It goes into your liver. It's got receptors in your liver. It sticks to them. It has an impact. It goes into your breast tissue. It's got receptors. It goes into your brain. It's got receptors. Postpartum depression, right? You throw that off, you get depression. You throw off your liver, you get all kinds of weird blood clotting issues. I mean, on and on and on, right? Breast cancer. Breast cancer is up 250% since 1980. And raising awareness and passing out pink ribbons is definitely not solving the problem. We have to recognize what the root cause is. In this case, it's these chemicals. They're deceiving the estrogen receptor and tricking your body into thinking that you've got all kinds of estrogen. Let's grow some breasts, or let's screw up our fertility, right? Our body basically thinks that we're pregnant. Store more fat. That's another one. So there's a lot of things. Even children, for example, with higher BPA concentrations in their urine, higher depression.
Interesting. So, I mean, you touched a little bit on some of the downstream effects of this. Like, obviously, if you add an exogenous hormone on top of your normal production, you have a lot of problems with downstream effects. But so, how would you think about breaking those down? Does it impact all health conditions? Are there things that people should be thinking about primarily? Like, what is your sort of thought on? We have high amount of these in our environment, and it's leading to these top 5 things.
Exactly. There's very predictable things. In my book, I listed a top 7 list, I think, because you see, when you study phthalates, you see a bunch of health issues, but you see about 7 that also you see when you study BPA. And then when you study, there's a chemical called oxybenzone that's in sunscreen. If you go to Walmart and you just look at all the sunscreens, you'll be shocked how many have oxybenzone. And they did a study 2 years ago and showed that one application of sunscreen, your levels of oxybenzone, which again acts like estrogen, it's bad for you. The levels in your blood 7 days later are above the government's own recommended limits. And that's just from one application, right? So then you throw in oxybenzone, you start looking at the health problems. Oh, they match up with the BPA and the phthalates. You throw in the parabens. Oh, all the health problems match up with the BPA and the phthalates and the oxybenzone. And then there's another one in mold. There's other ones, right? I mean, there's atrazine, which is a herbicide. There's a mold toxin that acts like estrogen, and our mold, our grains in America particularly have a ton of mold compared to European grains, for example, because they have stricter regulation on that. And so there's a bunch, right? There's a long list of daily exposures that most people are getting. And like I say, about 7 health issues. So breast cancer being one, or man boobs in men, gynecomastia, infertility, depression, weight gains like fat, adiposity. Let's see. I can't think of all 7 off the top of my head, but that's pretty close, right? That's 4 or 5 for you.
Yeah. And I mean, these are things that affect people in such great degree that people generally have no feedback loop. I think it's easier in health when you have, maybe you eat something and we're talking about, okay, grains may have mold and they may have these problems and downstream effects, but if somebody has like a severe gluten intolerance, they'll feel like shit right after they eat it. Whereas a lot of this stuff, I mean, it's a sort of a bioaccumulation and blocking some receptors and having hormonal problems where they can't say like, okay, I'm eating plastic or eating from plastic or using these products that have these xenoestrogens in them, and then I feel bad from it via that way. So it's really hard for people to connect the dots, I think. So, I mean, how do you think about, I mean, you just talked about how many different ways this can enter somebody's environment. What is sort of the order of operations? Somebody listening to this is now freaked out that everything's poisoning them essentially, which tends to happen on this podcast pretty frequently. But just curious as far as like when you're thinking first step, remove all plastic, second step, filter your drinking water. Like what is sort of in your mind the big areas to focus on if you're going to do like an 80-20 sort of analysis here?
Yep. Yeah. Personal care products. So drinking water, plastic storage, and food, personal care products. And glass, by the way, for food storage, awesome. Stainless steel, awesome. Personal care products, you got to get rid of those cheapy ones you get from mass production, with all the chemicals that you can't read, unless they're fragrance free. Oftentimes, if they're fragrance free, they don't have the chemicals in them. But it's better to get a brand or a company that you trust, or again, look for fragrance free. And I even created a website page, like ajconsultingcompany.com is my website. Terrible URL, I know, but I created a website page that just shows people what I use for the soaps and for the laundry detergent and for the deodorant and all these different personal care things, because there's a lot of them and it's hard to do that research and find affordable ones. So what I tried to do is find, there's a lot of good companies out there that are making soap. And if you go to Whole Foods, it's almost overwhelming. But, which ones are inexpensive? Which ones are affordable? Because I go through a lot of soap. I have 4 kids. So things like that. I just said, well, here's what I use, and you don't have to use what I use, but here's a list of all the different things. So I think the personal care is a major target that people shouldn't overlook. And then the foods, of course, generally, if you're just avoiding grains, you're doing yourself a massive 80-20 favor. But of course, there's a lot of other little nuance all throughout. The birth control, for example, right? If you're taking birth control, you're obviously increasing artificial estrogen,
right?
Because it's designed as an artificial estrogen. And ironically, lavender can disrupt your hormones. Now, it's anti-inflammatory, so it has some beneficial properties, but it's fairly well established, particularly with people that actually research it, because it activates the estrogen receptor virtually as much as estradiol, if you compare them head to head on the estrogen receptor. So a lot of health companies use lavender essential oil, and I get a lot of flack for this, but it's the research. It's what the research shows. They've tested multiple different brands. Most people will say, well, my brand doesn't act like, it's like, well, have you studied it? Like, have you checked your brand? How do you know? Because that's the big one that when I give talks at these big health conferences, like the Keto Con, I gave a talk for about 5,000 people last year. Most of the sponsors, of course, have lavender essential oil in their products. And I always show people the research. It's like, here's the research. I think plastics are worse for you. I think a lot of these fake petroleum products are a lot worse, but still, if you're sensitive to estrogen, if you've got some of these estrogen issues, let's get them all. Let's not be putting them on, at least not every day. So that's my approach.
Right. So we chatted earlier about how bogus some of these reference ranges are and how hard it is to get actually a good test. So if somebody maybe is thinking, okay, I could have been too exposed to all this stuff. I was eating out of plastic. I was putting all these weird things in my skin. How does one sort of assess their status here of their hormones, and how do they know if this is appropriate? Like, can they trust reference ranges? What should they look at? What tests should they run?
Yeah, the big one by far is testosterone. Even for women, having optimal ranges for testosterone, super valuable. And I've seen people absolutely reverse their low testosterone by just eliminating these estrogens. Just doing, in my book, I have 3 plans. One's called the gold plan, the silver plan, and the bronze plan. Because of course, if you're on a budget, you're in college, whatever, you don't want to spend a lot of money doing this. So you do the bronze plan, right? But if you're a pro athlete, you really want to go crazy, get all these estrogen chemicals out, you do the gold plan. I've seen people get rid of these estrogens and double their testosterone, 184%, increase their testosterone, things like that. Check your testosterone. And you want to be on the upper end of the range. For men, at least be above 500 is what I like to see. And for women, again, upper end of the range. Don't be if you're on the low end, you're for sure low. And again, try the natural things. Try the heavy lifting, weightlifting, exercise, sleep better, just de-stress, get rid of these estrogen chemicals. And then, of course, if you need to, get on testosterone replacement therapy, because having these low sex hormones is really problematic for health.
Okay, so your sort of approach is to assess where you're at, try everything that you can, sort of from an environmental standpoint, to change that around, and then the next step you think would be to look into maybe some sort of hormone replacement.
Correct. Yeah, I've seen it work really well for a lot of people, and the main reason, I'm such a big fan is because the sex hormones, so a lot of hormones bind receptors on your cells, right? So you have these cells, they have a cell wall. Imagine like a pillow with a pillowcase, and there's receptors sticking out, and they grab onto the hormone, and they have a signal inside the cell. They transmit a signal inside the cell. Testosterone and estrogen, like sex hormones, they don't do that. They go right through the pillowcase. They go right into the cell. A lot of hormones don't go into the cell. And so that's unique, number one. But not only do they go into the cell, they also go into the nucleus. The nucleus has its own membrane. It's like got its own pillowcase. There's like a cell inside of a cell just to protect your DNA. And hardly anything goes into there. Like your DNA is very well protected because that cell wall is more stringent. It's more cautious about letting things in. Sex hormones go through that cell wall. They go into the nucleus and they interact directly on your DNA. And that's why they're so massively impactful. And you see it in these bodybuilders that take loads of steroids because, right? I mean, it can create these huge changes if you overdose. And I'm not saying people should overdose. I'm just saying you see it. It's pretty obvious. And these artificial estrogens, of course, can screw that up because they can also get in there and start screwing with your DNA. And the thing it's called, the process is called epigenetics. We have these marks on top of our DNA. And for people that are starting to get lost with all this, the analogy I like to use is musical notes, because, you know, if you've got a song, like it's just black notes on a staff, da, 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 it's just musical notes, and you pass that to somebody else, they can play that same song. That's your DNA. Super simple melody, pass it to somebody else, they can play it, pass it to somebody else, they can play it. It doesn't really change. Now, if you add chords on top of those notes, you add more notes and make it more complicated. The melody is still there. The DNA is still there. It doesn't change. But now you've got chords. Now you've got epigenetics. Now you've got marks on top of the DNA. And what's crazy about those epigenetic marks, they get passed on as well. So to future generations. So your kids get altered, right? It's not just the DNA. And the artificial estrogen chemicals, they screw up your epigenetics. So oftentimes in animal studies, even if the parents aren't screwed up by these estrogens, these fake estrogens, the offspring will be. So the next generation, we see it 4 generations out. There's a scientist named Michael Skinner. He's given a TED talk on this, and he had a scientific paper in 2005 that was the most cited scientific research paper for 5 straight years from 2010. Yeah, which is ridiculous if you're a scientist, like how impactful that truly is. And it was about epigenetic marks and estrogen, fake estrogen, and how it impacted from 4 generations, which was mind-boggling, because previous to that, people thought it was just genetics. It's like, well, how can you screw up your health and pass on those screw-ups to your next generation? Well, it's epigenetics. It's those notes on top of the melody. So that's the true impact of these chemicals. And the beauty of proper sex hormones, kind of bringing this back full circle, the beauty of testosterone and estrogen, having those optimized, they reverse those screwed up marks. When you screw up all those musical notes, you know, again, it's not your DNA, it's the marks on top of the DNA. We screw that up. You can oftentimes reverse it by getting your sex hormones back.
Interesting. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. So curious, you say, okay, if you have low status, low testosterone, for example, you try all these things and it's not turning around. Is this sort of just like an irreversible decline, and is there permanent damage done? I mean, so the way I think about this in other parts of health, like, you know, my previous career was a lot in musculoskeletal stuff, but if somebody rolls their ankle walking off of a curb, you can heal from that, no problem. If they step off of the same curb and get run over by a bus and split their leg open and have crazy surgery, like you're not going to function the same way, so you have to work around it. Same thing with even like a low-carb ketogenic diet. Some people just need it short-term to reverse the metabolic problems. Some people need it forever just because their pancreas is so busted. Is this sort of the same thing you think of when you think, okay, some people need to go on hormone replacement therapy, and is that long-term just given the amount of damage that's been done over the years?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's an awesome analogy. I mean, you know, some people have the broken leg, a minor fracture, they fix it and get off it. Like for me, for example, I have a prescription for testosterone. I get the bioavailable, the natural stuff. I don't get some fake version of it. And I only use it if I hurt my back. I have like a screwed up disc in my back, and I've thrown my back out since I was 12 years old. And I have some bad genes there. And one of them is called interleukin-1 alpha, for example. And I've done research on that gene, and testosterone inhibits that form of inflammation in your discs in your back. So if I throw my back out, it used to be a full week of like being in bed. Like I couldn't even get out of bed. It was like an emergency. It was crazy. And it would be about a month before I could even do a little bit of light lifting in the gym. If I get on testosterone cream when I throw my back out now, and it's pretty rare that I do, but I still play hockey and all this stuff. I'm like this old guy doing all this crazy stuff, water skiing and whatever. I'll get on testosterone and I'm not kidding. It's like I'm up and at it. I'm back in the gym in like 3 or 4 days. And then I get off of it.
Got it. So you use it sort of as a tool here or there. But for some people, they may need to do it just indefinitely.
Exactly.
Got it.
100%.
Is there like a threshold where you're like, okay, you've tried this for 6 months and it didn't turn around to do this? Or is it a year? How do you think about time it takes to sort of restore baseline once you correct your environment?
Yeah, good question. Uh, I'm not sure. It's such a case by case thing. And it depends on there's all these other factors that also influence testosterone. Like if you're super deficient in magnesium, for example, it might have nothing to do with the artificial estrogens. You just need magnesium, or zinc or whatever the hell.
Yeah.
So oftentimes you have to look at the case and say, oh, you're not sleeping at all. Well, seriously, you just got to start sleeping, so I don't want to generalize because there's people out there that. Another one is heavy metals. That's a common one that decreases testosterone. People have a lot of mercury or a lot of like the weird heavy metals, cobalt, chromium, cadmium, and they'll decrease testosterone. And then they get on testosterone replacement because, my testosterone is low and I got rid of all my artificial estrogens, but it's still low. Well, it's not going to help when you get on testosterone replacement because you've got all these heavy metals. They didn't go away. You're still going to have neurotoxicity and all these toxicities from the heavy metals. So you got to address the root cause, and finding that can be kind of customized and tricky sometimes.
Right. So is there any downside for, let's say somebody, you said, I'm not going to touch synthetic stuff. Here's the bioavailable things. Like, what should people know? I think there's just such a stigma on hormones, given, like you said, the super roided out people who take an excess to win a bodybuilding competition. So like, how do you think about sources, amounts, safety, things like that? Yeah,
it's generally, if you just work with a good doctor who optimizes hormones, they're not going to let you overdose. And, you can get pretty high before you're overdosing. You can bring your testosterone up to like 1500. And, oftentimes it's about symptoms. You're looking at symptoms. So, because again, testosterone, our epigenetics gets so screwed up in our culture today. It sometimes takes pretty high level to get people back to feeling like they've got amazing energy and sex drive and motivation and all this. And there's no downside. They used to say that there was an increased risk of plaque in your arteries from having high testosterone. I'm not talking about bodybuilder high. I'm just saying like 1500, 2000, like pretty dang high, but not outrageously high. But now they've reversed their stance. Even conventional medicine has said, oh, we were wrong. It doesn't actually. It actually improves risk of heart disease. There's actually less heart disease when you do testosterone replacement. The only reason they initially said it is a risk for heart disease was because it increases cholesterol. So they assumed it would increase risk of heart disease. It actually, now that they've studied it, is actually the opposite. So kind of full circle way back to when we were talking about cholesterol and what a joke that situation has been. But it's such a case-by-case thing. I think people have to work with somebody who's like a good hormone optimizer, and be careful with aromatase inhibitors. A lot of people like to shut off estrogen and inhibit their natural estrogen. And that's a real problem too. Estrogen is also protective, just like testosterone. Natural estrogen, phenomenally protective. It's protective for your bone density. It's protective for your brain. It's protective for your arteries. And the ratio matters. So if your testosterone is high and your estrogen is high, thumbs up, you're doing awesome. If your testosterone is low and your estrogen is high, that's a huge problem, right? I mean, the ratio matters, but I wouldn't get too overly excited. If a doctor is trying to get you on aromatase inhibitors, I'm always leery if that's like their first line of treatment.
And these things are like Clomid, clomiphene, things like that.
Exactly.
And so, I've heard that also if you take exogenous testosterone, for example, if you're a male, it's like, and you want to have kids, you're going to produce less sperm because you have a negative feedback loop in your body. Is this correct? Or like how you think through who's this right for, who's this not right for?
It depends on the levels, right? Because if your testosterone is 200 and you bump it up to 500, you'll probably increase your sperm production. It's probably nothing but benefits. Yeah. But if your testosterone is 600 and then you're bumping it up to 1500 or something, you're going to have some negative feedback with, FSH or LSH or whatever. And there's probably decreased sperm production. And so it's a factor, but I don't generally think it's a major factor. But it depends. If that's a struggle for people, it's a good consideration.
Yeah. And I guess the question is like, is it a permanent thing? Like if you start, the thing is like, if you start doing this, you have to do it for the rest of your life.
No, I don't. I don't have any issues. I lean down quite a bit if I get on testosterone, and then I get a little bit more, puffy or whatever when I get off of it. But it's pretty temporary. It takes a couple of weeks and my body adapts and I get off. But again, I think that analogy of the broken leg versus the smashed leg is a great analogy, because some people do really truly need to stay on it for the rest of their life, and they have to be willing for that to do that. But once you see those health benefits and all that extra energy and all that extra motivation and things, most people want to stay on it if they really need to stay on it.
Right. Yeah.
Not like pulling teeth.
Can people ever, like, say they have suppression, go on it short term and kick back any of these feedback mechanisms to produce more? Or is it sort of like, if you're at that level, you're just at that level, nothing's really going to help you, and you just
yeah, I think so. I don't know. I mean, it's so complicated.
Yeah.
When you're doing case by case stuff. Yeah.
Interesting. So it sort of like brings me to the next thing I want to dive in on, which is just, as you're talking about, there's so much specificity, and you brought up the IL-1 sort of inflammatory pathway for yourself and genetics. Like, what got you interested in DNA, and like, what are some of the top things there you see that people often don't talk about?
Yeah, well, and way back when 23andMe first came out, I did my analysis. I did my sequencing. I had my DNA sequenced, just the SNPs, of course. But I mean, they had like 950,000 SNPs that they were sequencing. It's a lot of data. It's a lot of information. And basically all they were telling people was like, oh, your eye color is green. Right. And like little things like that. And I thought it was kind of a joke because I knew my eye color, number one, but also there was so much more info there. So I started digging into it. And long story short, I ended up developing my own software to analyze health risks and health issues, and basically just to help people optimize. So like, for example, some people, they don't break down artificial estrogen very well, these BPAs and these phthalates and things like that. And you can look at that with your 23andMe data, and you can say, look, you've got a bigger risk for man boobs and things like that. And ironically, everybody I know that has man boobs, I do this every day. I do DNA consulting. Every person that I come across that already has gyno, they have man boobs, they have that gene, ironically enough, where they don't break down these artificial estrogen chemicals. And it's not that many people. It's like 5% of people have that risk gene. So it's a major impact. And there's a lot of them, right? So what I do is I do 5 categories. I look at brain optimization genes. I look at diet optimization genes. I look at vitamin hormone detox optimization, kind of how your body breaks things down. I look at exercise related optimization genes, and then finally sleep. So those are the 5 categories. And there's so much information there. And people generally like trying to generalize and say, oh, vegan is best for everybody, right? Or whatever, carnivore is best for everybody, or this is best for everybody, or that's best for everybody. There's usually a lot more nuance there, and it's good to know the nuance. It's powerful, right? I always say knowledge is power. Everybody says that. It's basically cliche. Knowledge is power, and this is how you use that knowledge. You can use your genetic code to know more about yourself, and then to optimize your health in a more precise way instead of just guessing.
How do you sift through the research on this stuff? I mean, I've just been curious and sort of sampling, sort of looking into stuff, and like the amount of stuff that's coming out is so extensive. Like, how do you make sure that you're not getting tricked by some of these ridiculously poor studies that I think, like, and there's been previous companies who have pulled in a lot of this data, and there's all these associative things that say, okay, people have this gene and that means that. And so this means this for you.
Right. It's a mess. Yeah. Well, the main thing is I have a cutoff, and, a lot of these reports, these genetic reports and these companies, you'll get like 50 pages of health risks and all this stuff, and they're all associations. So it'll say like, you have a 1.3-fold increased risk for this kind of cancer, a 1.5-fold increased risk for that kind of cancer. It's just on and on and on and on and on. It freaks people out. But the funny thing is, when they redo those studies, say they find an increased risk of breast cancer, 1.3-fold. When they redo those studies with larger groups of people, it almost never holds up. It's not robust. It's because it's just an association. These epidemiology studies are pretty faulty as it is. So I'm always looking at least for a 2-fold higher risk for something. So I'm looking at the big hitters, the real problems, the ones that impact people. And they're surprising. There's a lot of them. And then you have to kind of understand the mechanisms of what's going on. Like I say, your liver is breaking down these artificial estrogens better or worse or whatever. And there's oftentimes a lot of biochemistry studies that are done on these things. So basically it's just a lot of work. And over the years, I've just kind of sifted through it and went, because a lot of the research was done a long time ago. It's been 5+ years. Now, most of the cutting edge research has shifted from genetics to epigenetics. And so a lot of scientists even And certainly a lot of people out there, they kind of downplay genetics and say, it's just, that's old school. Now we're looking at epigenetics. But it's not really something to be downplayed. They're both super important. I wouldn't look down on genetics and I wouldn't look down on epigenetics. I would use them both. But right now we don't have the technology to like sequence your epigenetics and look at it, at least cheaply. It costs about 20 grand to do it. I've looked into doing it personally for epigenetics. So right now, all we can do is look at our genetics. So it's not the full story, but it's a pretty massive part of the story, and it's very predictive. It's like having a crystal ball. Like if I see some of these Alzheimer's risk genes, I'll ask people like, hey, Alzheimer's runs in your family, huh? And they'll be like, oh yeah, my grandmother has it, my great whatever, this person, my aunt. You can predict it because it's predictive if you've got genes that are powerful, like if you've got the correct genes. Yeah. And speaking of Alzheimer's, I've even thought about writing a book. I've kind of been working on a book because right now we're just saying Alzheimer's is Alzheimer's. Kind of like we used to say cancer is cancer. Oh, you've got cancer. Now it's like, oh, you've got lung cancer, you've got liver cancer, you got whatever, you got B-cell lymphoma. You don't just have lymphoma, you have B-cell lymphoma. You don't just have B-cell lymphoma, you have CD20 positive B-cell lymphoma. You get more and more and more specific, and that helps you treat the cancer in a more precise way. It's better. And Alzheimer's is the same way. Right now, we're just saying Alzheimer's. It's so silly. And there's at least 5 different categories for Alzheimer's. Like some people have genetic risks for heavy metal clearance in their brain. Their brain doesn't clear heavy metals very well. And that's a risk for Alzheimer's. Some people brain doesn't manage sugar very well. It doesn't manage carbs very well. That's a risk for Alzheimer's. And by the way, most people shouldn't be eating carbs, like irrespective of your genetics. If you have a high carb diet, it's almost certainly suboptimal. And again, there's certain patterns you see when you do enough genetic analysis that pretty much apply to everybody. So like every once in a while, I find one person out of a lot of people that can manage carbs phenomenally well. It's really, really rare.
What are you talking about here as far as high carb? What would you consider high carb?
Oh, gee, good question. I mean, like 50% carbs by calorie. I know a lot of people that eat 50% carbs by calorie in the training athletic world. It's crazy.
Yeah, we're at like a couple 100 grams a day. I mean, I think like
right.
Generally speaking, when you're eating real food, especially like I try to simplify as many things as possible down to as few words as possible. And so think about like nutrition. I've come up with this thing, just like eat local. If you can go to a farmer's market or a farm to get the animal products, like you're going to solve a lot of the problems. And if you do that, it is so hard to eat over like 100 grams of carbs in a day.
Right.
You're eating roots and tubers, even like high carb things, not getting rice, not getting things like this. Like, okay, some cultures have that, but they probably also have some of these genetic components, like, with Asian cultures having different amylase in their saliva to break down carbohydrates a little bit differently. It's like, obviously that's the case, but if you're looking about eating locally, yeah, it's like you have to make it work to eat over a couple 100 grams of carbs in a day and like eat processed foods by definition, which is never a good idea.
Yeah, exactly. So there's certain patterns, but there's also certain specificities that help people optimize. And again, the more precise you can get in all of these categories, it's a huge topic because there's so many different aspects that I will look at when I do these genetic consults, but I think it's worth, a lot of them interconnect, right? Like speaking of heavy metals in the brain, some people have a risk for Alzheimer's because of heavy metals in the brain, and iron is actually included in that. So like if your iron is really high, your ferritin, you're actually at risk for Alzheimer's, because that's one of these metals your brain doesn't clear very well. It's not a heavy metal technically, but it's still, it's in that same class. And then you got to go way down to the detox section and look, well, how does my body handle iron? So it's interconnected with that section. So some people say, well, can you give me a discount and just look at the brain section? I'm just worried about my genetics in the brain. Well, it's pretty interconnected. If you're sleeping poorly, your brain's not going to perform optimally, and it's not the fault of your genes in your brain. It's the fault of your genes in your sleep and bad habits that aren't aligning with those genes. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Interesting. It's like, what were some of the things that surprised you most when you started diving into this? I mean,
vitamin. Oh, sorry. I missed the last half of that.
You already talked about a couple of them, but just curious as far as other things that were like, oh, this is, did not realize this. Yeah.
Well, vitamin E is my favorite because, and maybe even retinol. Well, let's use retinol. So as you probably know, vitamin A is a broad term. It's not just one thing. It's a whole class. So vitamin A includes beta carotene, and it also includes retinol. Now, plants make carotenes. That's why carrots are orange. They named carotene after carrots because they find a lot of carotene in carrots. Makes them orange. Plants have a lot of carotene. Humans don't use carotene. Our bodies, animals don't use carotene. So it's not really a vitamin until your body converts it to retinol, and which is, again, also called vitamin A, but it's a different form. And the retinol is the animal form. And of course, they discovered retinol in the retina, in the eyes. So it's important for your vision, but even more importantly, it's important for your stem cells and your immune system, which nobody talks about because the name is retinol. So people just think about the eyes. But anyways, a lot of people have a terrible conversion, like an 80% decreased conversion of beta carotene to retinol. So they can eat all the carrots in the world and they're still pretty much vitamin A deficient, or they're real low on vitamin A. And again, because they're not converting it to retinol, they don't have the usable form. So they need to eat liver, or they need to eat egg yolks at least to try and get like actual animal products to get that retinol. So if they're a vegan or something and they're supplementing vegan supplements, which are retinol or beta carotene, it's never going to work for them. Like it's a vicious cycle of just plugging up their system. I've literally seen people that turn their skin orange. Have you ever seen that? With the carotene? Yeah, if you take too much carotene,
it's ridiculous.
And I'm not talking about Donald Trump. I'm not talking about talking about like actual supplements can turn your skin orange if you overdo them because your body's not converting it. So anyways, that's a really interesting example. There's a million of them, of course, but that was shocking to me because I personally have one of those gene issues. It's not full blown 80% problem, but it's about 50% reduction. And I eat more liver now,
Right. And so has that sort of led you down a similar path of, it just makes sense for people to eat fewer carbs, it makes sense for people to eat animal products to some degree? Or like, what are the broad strokes things have you found out that could apply to pretty much everybody?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think carbs is the big one, and intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting, virtually everybody has genes where they want to increase autophagy, they want to increase intermittent fasting, whether it's for your thyroid gland, whether it's for your pancreas and for your blood sugar and all this, and for your fat cells, for your obesity risk. Everybody has genes that relate to intermittent fasting. So it pretty much can just tell people intermittent fast, irrespective of your genetics.
Right.
And lower carbs is generally true. Again, that's a little customizable, but I mean, beyond that, just the basics that everybody knows, like exercise, obviously super important, right? I mean, there's some obvious things, irrespective of your genetics, people should be doing. And most people know about that and they're talking about that.
Yeah. So sleep, don't be stressed out, eat real food, move often.
Right.
It's like these exactly things that we should have part of our environment. We don't. Man, this has been an action-packed thing here. So I mean, I think we'll actually finish there just because I think that anything more in people's heads might explode just because we've covered quite a lot and now people might be a little overwhelmed by it. But I mean, these are a lot of things that I think, again, just correcting your environment is a really good step to get back to where all these problems are sourced from. So appreciate all the time. Where can people find the work you've done? Obviously, you mentioned the book a few times and the website, but where would you like to point people?
Yeah, the book is called Xenoestrogens. I published a few years ago. It's not like super new, but it's becoming a bigger, it's gained momentum. I just gave a talk last week in Utah, excuse me, over 300 medical doctors. It was for CME credits, for continuing medical education credits. And it was about this topic. It's becoming a bigger and bigger, more awareness, right? And AJ Consulting Company is my website. Again, terrible URL, AJ Consulting Company. I have to actually add the word company on the end, but that's where I do all my DNA consulting and I have all my products that I like and recommend to people. So that's pretty much the main source.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing all the work and making some of this stuff simple for people. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for bringing me on. I appreciate your podcast and the stuff you're doing.
All right, Doc. Chat soon.
All right, take care.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Natural State Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate you heading over to whatever service you're listening to this podcast on, dropping me a 5-star review and your thoughts on the show. This helps us get discovered by more people and spreading the good gospel of health. And if you want to stay plugged into all of my self-health experiments, recent research and books that I'm reading and my interpretations of those things, products that I'm testing and thoughts on all things related to health, check out my free weekly newsletter called The Feed. You can sign up for that at dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. That's dranthonygustin.com/thefeed. Thanks again for tuning in and your support of the Natural State Podcast.